Buju, wago shindagu migizi indodem, gazaga squaji mekag, indunjaba. For anyone who gets serious about Indigenous language revitalization, we eventually end up having to think about how we can develop new words for new technologies and new concepts. For example, if you're going to run an immersion school and scale it up throughout middle school and high school, you have to talk about a constitution and a Bill of Rights, even though our people did not have a constitution or Bill of Rights back in the day. So languages have to shift and change with the times. Similarly, we have to be able to do our geometry and algebra lessons and speak to different kinds of geography and new technological concepts. Even the English words motherboard and firewall didn't exist just a few decades ago. So all languages have to shift and change, and we have to be able to expand the lexicon, the vocabulary to talk about these things. When we first started doing this work with Ojibwe, we ran into all kinds of roadblocks. Some of them included, how do we, work with great first speakers who know our language inside and out, but really don't know even the new technology or the algebraic concepts that we're trying to communicate eventually to young people. We also had to navigate dialect variation. So with Ojibwe, we have a huge collection of dialects. There are 141 Ojibwe First Nations in Canada and many Ojibwe communities in the United States across Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, and so forth. And the vocabulary is different, and dialect issues are significant for across some of that space. And so when we were starting this, Eugene Stillday was alive. And I remember one time, I was telling him, we want to do some work on algebra. And he said, "What? Algebra? Why don't you just teach our kids who they are? Forget about all that stuff. Let's talk about our culture and our ways and, things like that." And I had to say, Eugene, I love you. And I couldn't agree more strongly. That's what we really want to do. But for these schools, which are taking money from state governments to fund the operations of the school and pay the staff, we end up having to speak to state curricular guidelines and things like that. And if you can't help us do this in Ojibwe, we're going to be doomed and forced to do it in English. And by the way, across the ocean in China, there are, 1 billion people who are learning about algebra, and it doesn't make them less Chinese because they're doing it in Chinese. Will you help us? And he said, "Fine, I'll help you, but I still don't know what algebra means in any language." But that was enough for us to get started. And we started convening teams of people. Sometimes we would have as many as 9 different dialects represented, oftentimes working across several dialects. And we had to develop our own process. So for Ojibwe, it's actually quite different than what they did with Hawaiian. With Hawaiian, they've assembled a team, and they might spend days to decide on, 7 new words or something like that. One of the things that was, interesting about Ojibwe is that a lot of the morphemes, the smallest meaningful parts of words, tended to be more commonly known to more everyday speakers of Ojibwe, which is why some people will say it's just funnier in Ojibwe, and also why it's so descriptive. And as a result, we were able to describe new things. So for example, in Ojibwe, across all dialects, all people will understand what you're talking about when you say Mazinate Sijigan, which is our word for a television set. Muz is an image. Ate has to do with reflected light. And the igun ending is a common noun ending. So a box that reflects an image through light describes a TV. And it doesn't matter if you're out at Wikwemikong, on Manitoulin Island, if you're in Turtle Mountain, if, you're out at, the Quebec border at Temagami First Nation, or, in Lecouture, Wisconsin, everyone would know what a Masanate Sijigan is. And that's the beauty of the descriptive roots of the language, is that it does provide a way to develop new vocabulary, and also in a way that makes sense to speakers even across dialects. So as we assembled our team, we said we're not going to pick the standard new word, for whatever the concept, but that we would simply say every speaker in the room is correct. And we would often work by having two projectors. One had just a list of words, and whatever we were putting in on the typewriter or the computer was projecting up, and the elders could see the words. And another one would just have images and other things to get them thinking about the concept so that they could describe them in ways that made sense to them. Because oftentimes an abstract concept, like condensation, they're like, I don't know. But once they started seeing pictures, they said, oh yeah, well, there are all kinds of different ways we can describe that. And so if everybody in the room agreed, this is the word, aboise for condensation, then fine, we'd put it in there like that. If someone said, here's how we'd say it here and here's how we'd say it there, then we would put in both of those words, and we would code by speaker and put both words into the dictionary. And so we did a number of them like this. So one example was the Anin Ekidong book, which we did lexical expansion for. We did Asia Chigeang and some other ones. And it ended up being really, really productive. Oftentimes, quite interestingly, there was a cross-pollination between speakers. So, for example, Maji Gwineash, Gordon Jourdain, who grew up in a monolingual community, worked as a carpenter on a roofing crew, and knew words for angle, pitch, and square footage, would say, here's how I say that. And someone like Eugene Stillday from Panema, who ended up going to school at age 7 and school in English. And so when he was introduced to angle, pitch, and square footage, he was learning about it in English, even though his knowledge of Ojibwe was great. And he spoke Ojibwe his whole life, including with his wife every day, throughout his life. But when he would hear Gordon's word, he'd say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Here's how we'd say it where I'm from. And so without adopting someone else's dialect or whatever, they were able to reinforce and spark one another's language productivity. And so it was pretty awesome. Sometimes we'd have to really take our time with things. Like, for example, that word for condensation. At first, everybody's staring at us like we were crazy people saying a word like that. But once we put up pictures, they had all kinds of words. And in fact, I'll just read you a little bit about condensation. We have all kinds of words. So as a noun, abwe big. So abwe is a root that comes up in other words, even like abwezo, where you get the little spots of water in the form of perspiration. B has to do with something in a liquid form. Others said, for example, abwe win as the noun for what condensation is. And then Ojibwe has a lot of texture roots that are built into things. So abwe yamagad would be if something condenses in the air. And abwe bigad if something condenses on fabric, for example, dew on the tent or something like that. Abwe abakad if it condenses on glass or metal. So like Rose Tainter offered, that's when the people are parked with the windows up at the drive-in movie theater or something like that. And then, there are many, many different other ones too. Abwe se, everybody agreed would work for base condensation or condensing on an object. And that's just an example of one of the kinds of words. But again, helpful when we had the picture, when we could accommodate and support all dialects rather than battle between them, when we had a shared understanding of what we were trying to do and how we could use it. And now that is common vocabulary, when we're doing science units on condensation. And there are many, many others, of course. So, social studies, mathematics, and even terms of punctuation and things like that. We've been able to expand into all of those areas. We did most of the content for this whole book. It's a skinnier book, but we did it all in really 3 days. And then we ran through all of the lists and double checked things and worked on different ways to expand them. And then John Nichols would sit down with speakers and run them through his protocol and put the words into the Ojibwe People's Dictionary or things like that. So it's been very helpful and productive. The dynamics for different languages are different, and so you have to work with the knowledge of your language carriers and speakers and with the morphological composition of your language in order for it to be authentic, understood and supported by everybody in your language community. But the bottom line is there are ways to do lexical expansion effectively with your people, your way, and have it be useful as you continue to build immersion schools and programs. Miigwech. Thanks for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer. Let's keep in touch. I'm active on social media, and my website has lots of information on my books, speaking engagements, resources for the Ojibwe language, teachers, and more. Miigwech.